Hey, what's going on, gang? Nate on the Stone here. Welcome back to my channel, and welcome back to me as well. In just about a week, it's going to be Halloween, and in better times, more innocent times, we wouldn't be watching Michael Myers once again kill a house full of people in a movie called Halloween Kills, which is really odd, seeing as that's what he does every time he's ever been shown on the screen. We would instead be gathering around fires and bonfires, reading stories by Nathaniel Hawthorne, Edgar Allan Poe, and Washington Irving, who you probably know as the author of The Legend of Sleepy Hollow, Ichabod Crane, Headless Horseman, and all that good stuff. But upon thinking about the season and Irving, I happen to think that another one of his stories, the story of Rip Van Winkle, actually happens to be more apropos for our time. So in case you might know, Rip Van Winkle, an old Dutchman in New York, gets lost in the Catskill Mountains, finds a group of goblins, fays, not quite clear, plays nine pins with them, that's bowling to you and me, and because he's drinking their grog, falls into a heavy sleep, doesn't wake up for another 20 years. Now, what's interesting about that is that Irving had to make Rip Van Winkle sleep for so long so that he would actually know that a considerable amount of time had passed. Things weren't exactly kosher when he woke up, because at that point in time, the very beginning of the 19th century, yeah, there were a lot of technological innovations, there was westward movement, but actually, in more cases than not, life stayed pretty much the same year in, year out. There weren't great, big, drastic, seismic changes from year to year, like what we have. Today, however, you don't have to sleep for 20 years to be Rip Van Winkle. You can go to sleep on a Friday night and wake up Saturday morning and the entire world has changed. This roundabout way is of saying that that is exactly what happened last week. People woke up on Friday morning with the world still relatively as it has been for the last 20 years, and woke up Saturday morning to find out that the Chinese now have hypersonic, that's the word I'm looking for, hypersonic nuclear capabilities. Here from CNBC. China tested a nuclear-capable hypersonic missile in August, showing a capability that caught U.S. intelligence by surprise, the Financial Times reported, citing 5 unnamed sources. The report late on Saturday said the Chinese military launched a rocket carrying a hypersonic glide vehicle that flew through low-orbit space, circling the globe before cruising towards its target, which missed by about 24 miles. 24 miles. Now that is an astounding feat, fait accompli, for the Chinese military. What makes this even better, at least if you're part of Beijing, is that the lower altitude of these new hypersonic missiles and the cruising capabilities pose a different sort of challenge to missile defense systems than do traditional ballistic missiles, which by definition follow a more predictable path from launch to target. That was actually Sohrab Omari writing in The American Conservative. So in other words, China not only has nuclear-capable hypersonic missiles, hypersonic, they can travel 5 times the speed of sound, but they can also, now, because of their low altitude, means that our missile defense system isn't going to be able to do as much against them. The missile defense system isn't going to worry the Chinese as much if they ever decide that, hey, you know what, I've got kind of an itchy international trigger finger, let's just launch one of these things over at Dallas or New Orleans or Chicago or something, just kind of as an exclamation point. For our American friends over there. And this isn't even, gang, the first time that China has actually been able to one-up the so-called lone superpower of the world in terms of military capacity. The Pentagon has been saying for a while now that China could very well have super weapons. I mean, genuine, actually, almost from a comic book or pulp adventure story super weapons that would make the conventional stuff that the Pentagon is working on looks like something made out of Play-Doh that came from a 1980s cheap Star Wars knockoff. More to the point even than that, the Chinese themselves have hinted that they've been mucking around with human genetics in order to make their own version of Captain America. We'll call him Captain Comrade. Before too long, Marvel will actually have added him to the roster of the equity, inclusive, diverse new Avengers that operates out of the Southern Poverty Law Center's basement or something. And even if, which, by the way, is actually entirely possible, we already know that the Chinese have been experimenting with human genetics. Just a few years ago, one of their scientists revealed that he had used the CRISPR-Cas9 genetic modification technology in order to actually genetically modify two twin girls. And it was 10 years ago, way back in 2011, the good old days of 2011, that it was finally outed that the Chinese had created a herd of 39 goats, which had human cardiovascular systems and human organs. The Chinese had been able to do this usually by the old injection method. They had injected goat embryos with human stem cells. But even if you think that super weapons, Captain Comrade style Chinese super soldiers is a bit too conspiracy theory X-Files for your taste, then consider the following, that China already has the largest navy in the world. China has also become very good buddies with the Taliban, having set roots at Bagram Airport, and which means that they are now friends with the force that was gifted $85 billion of U.S. military equipment, which includes Black Hawk helicopters and Humvees. And as even aside from the military capacity, China, as we've talked about here before, completely controls the supply lines to the United States. They control everything from the cheap plastics that we use to form the cheap toys that are used in the abysmal excuses for Happy Meals that we have these days, to rare earth metals that we use from everything from magnets to cell phones to aspirin and penicillin. In fact, if you've been wondering why car dealerships across the country have been having emptier and emptier lots, it's not because the cars aren't being made, it's because a computer chip that the cars actually need to work now, because everything has been computerized and digitized, is being held up in, you guessed it, China. Overseas. To use a line from Mark Stein, it's China's world, and we just live in it. But not to worry, the current administration is on the job.
Comment on reports that China tested a nuclear-capable hypersonic missile over the summer to the surprise of U.S. officials. Are these accurate, and do these raise concerns about China's nuclear capabilities?
Well, I know Secretary Austin, I should say, was asked this question this morning and addressed it, but I'm not going to comment on the specific report. I can say and would echo what he said, which is, generally speaking, we've made clear our concern about the military capabilities that the PRC continues to pursue. And we have been consistent in our approach with China. We welcome stiff competition, but do not want that competition to veer into conflict, and that is certainly what we convey privately as well.
And then on nominees, the Biden administration at this point has a smaller percentage of nominees confirmed than his.
We welcome the competition. Yeah, when you say that after being completely taken by surprise by something that you didn't even know that the Chinese were capable of doing, you're not welcoming the competition. You are acquiescing your own weakness to the new bully in town, which is exactly, gang, unfortunately, what is happening now. Let me put this in perspective. The U.S. military is the most fully and lavishly funded military apparatus in the entire world. In 2020, the Pentagon's budget for that year was $705 billion. This year, that has increased to $726 billion. We have more money than what we know to do with. We have more money in a sense than even God. And yet, for all of that money, for all that funding, for all the wonderful toys that the Pentagon seems capable of creating, not only can the military not win wars, i.e. see Afghanistan, not only can the military not defend the homeland, i.e. see the southern border, now we find out that the military can't even keep tabs on our enemies. Not even tabs. Even if you honestly believe that the Chinese somehow were a benevolent force for the Pacific area, keeping tabs on your competition, keeping tabs on someone who wasn't your enemy, but who also probably wasn't your friend either. After all, the only reason why we continually have to help South Korea against North Korea is also because North Korea is the puppy dog of, you guessed it again, Beijing. And this leads us to a much bigger problem than simply a military apparatus that is no longer an actual military apparatus. Serious question here, actually, if we can take just a slight detour in this video. Why do we still have the U.S. Army? Why do we still have the U.S. Navy, the Air Force, the Space Rangers, the Space Commandos, whatever they're called? Why do we even have the Pentagon? When they can't win wars and when they can't defend the homeland, why are we spending $726 billion to keep funding these bozos? Really, what is the rationale for that? And I'm sorry, but simply associating backing the military with patriotism is no longer going to do it, gang. We are in completely new waters. We actually have been now for a while, but if you really want to mark the demarcation point, it was last year. Last year should have been the wake-up call to all of us that nothing that we had assumed was actually going to still be relevant today. And we were going to have to create or find a completely different categorical way of thinking about politics, about philosophy, about the nature of conservatism itself. Or at the very least, we were going to have to realign ourselves and realize that the actions and the symbols and the words that had been used to actually mark ourselves as conservative, or at least people on the right, were no longer going to be efficient, or sufficient, I should say, efficient and sufficient, because everything else had been completely unmoored from where we all thought they were or where we all simply assumed that they were. But to get back to this point, there's much more at stake here than simply a military that's incapable of actually defending the southern border. That would be bad enough. And the real danger, the real reason why this combination, an ascendant China and a U.S. military that is so incompetent that it doesn't even know that China has the capacity to shoot a hypersonic missile in low orbital range until after the missile has circumnavigated the globe, and even then it actually took the Financial Times to break the story. It wasn't the military that finally admitted this. It was the Financial Times that broke the story. The real danger in all of this is power. The unfortunate, or maybe I should say just the plain fact of the matter, the birds and the bees in political philosophy, is that the core of politics and the core of the military is power. It's not about negotiation, it's not about diplomacy, it's not about compromise, it's not about anything really except power. Power is the engine in politics, and it's the military, because it's the way by which power is attained and then exercised, either within a society or outside that society. Now, different civilizations in different places of the world and in different times have had different laws, customs, and traditions by which that power is attained and then exercised, but the core has always remained the same. Power. Everything else is just extra. It's garnish. It's the complimentary mint at the end of the meal. Now, what this means is that the power doesn't go away, even when you are so incompetent that you can't even act as a functioning nation state anymore. The power stays the same. The power remains the core of politics and the military, which means that you have to keep exercising some degree of power in order to keep justifying your existence. Because again, to go back to our little divergent there, why keep the Pentagon if it can't actually do what militaries are supposed to do? Why keep Capitol Hill when it is obvious that it can't do the things that functioning governments are just supposed to be able to do, the day-to-day business that they are supposed to legitimately do? There is no reason, which means that a reason has to be created. And this means that the entire apparatus of the state, and particularly the apparatus of the military, going back again, the purpose of the military is to actually destroy things, protect things, and destroy things. That means that the state apparatus and the military is going to have to start fighting an enemy that it knows it can actually beat, i.e. us. At the beginning of October, the website Defense One reported that the Pentagon will begin continuous vetting of all troops for insider threats and extremism. Social media may come next. To quote just a little bit from the piece, all Defense Department personnel are now subject to continuous vetting designed to spot extremists and other insider threats, with surveillance of the public social media postings likely coming soon, Pentagon officials said Tuesday. Now, that's bad enough for people in the military. They're weeding out the people that they don't want in the military. But take this a step further. We are all now potential terrorists. Or, to let me rephrase that, everyone who doesn't toe the official narrative of the zeitgeist is a potential terrorist. Remember back to the so-called insurrection of January 6th, the insurrection that was such a danger to our democracy that none of the insurrectionists actually had any weapons on them at the time when they tried to overthrow the government. Well, after that, you might remember that Nancy Pelosi said that these people had chosen their whiteness over democracy, creating a contrast in the narrative between whiteness bad, democracy good. In other words, if you are for the left, if you are for the narrative and everything that it stands for, you're on the side of democracy, you're on the side of the heroes, Cap and Gandalf and all that good stuff. Meanwhile, if you act against the narrative in any way, shape, or form, you have chosen your whiteness over democracy, over the side of good. You are now with a goblin, with Sauron and Darth Vader and all that stuff. And what's more, because you've chosen your whiteness, you are also now a potential terrorist. And don't just think that it's only white people, Caucasians, who are going to be lumped into this group. You might remember, too, that the Washington Post earlier this year was talking about multiracial whiteness and whether Latinos who hail from Cuba or whose families originally came from Cuba should actually be considered authentically Hispanic because they tend to vote Republican, i.e. they tend to vote against the narrative. So in other words, we're all in the crosshairs of the military now. A military that is so incompetent that it can't actually defeat third world goat herders in Afghanistan. So it's going to turn to attacking us in order to keep justifying its own existence. And that actually has already started to expand this point from simply the military to the military and the entire state apparatus. The website American Greatness has been doing a great job publishing stories about the ongoing plight of many of the people who have been arrested for the insurrection of January 6th. And they published a piece about the condition of George Tanios. George Tanios was one of two people arrested back in March for the murder of Brian Sicknick, the police officer who we were told died, actually, because of the so-called insurrection. You might remember that it was first brandied about that Sicknick had died because evil Trump cultists had beamed him on the head, beaten him to death, in fact, with a fire extinguisher. And then it turned out that the New York Times actually recanted that story. And then a new narrative was actually created. The new narrative went that George Tanios and another friend of his, Julian Cater, had pepper sprayed him, and this had caused an allergic reaction with Sicknick, which had then led to his death. So, on March 15th, the Justice Department announced in a press release that George Tanios and Julian Cater had been arrested for spraying Sicknick and 2 other officers. Even though Tanios wasn't accused of using pepper spray, a magistrate judge denied bond on March 22nd. For 4 months, Tanios lived in the D.C. Correctional Treatment Facility, part of which is used solely to detain January 6th defendants. Now, that should raise red flags to begin. That should raise red flags, just by itself. But wait, there's more. Listen to this, gang. While Tanios was behind bars, the medical examiner's office in April 2021 finally confirmed the cause of Sicknick's death. He died of natural causes. 2 strokes caused by blood clots, not from an allergic reaction to any chemical. Tanios received rare good news on August 9 when the D.C. Circuit Court of Appeals reversed Hogan's detention order. Judge Hogan's detention order. The court denied Julian Cater's appeal. So in other words, these guys were arrested in March of 2021. A month later, the D.C. Medical Examiner's report finally came out that Brian Sicknick had died of natural causes, but it wasn't until August. May, June, July, August, 4 months later, that Tanios was actually released from jail. And Julian Cater is still behind bars. And get this, Tanios, who had no criminal record until the FBI itself actually broke down his door of his home in West Virginia. Tanios, who has no criminal record, is still not an exonerated man. Again, from this piece from American Greatness. Tanios went home on August 20th, but he's far from free. Tanios has been on home incarceration for more than 7 weeks and can't work until a judge relaxes the terms of his release. So even though the charge with which he was jailed with has been proven to be false, he's still being punished for it. This is the system. This is the system that will be normalized going forward. To justify their existence, the state apparatus, the military, and every other single institution and system which has been co-opted by the left, which means everyone that is important, is going to be attacking us in order to justify its own existence, because it can't do squat on the theater of the world. It has been proven to be completely incompetent. We're a global laughingstock on the stage of international relations. While the Chinese were busy creating a hypersonic missile, Rachel Levin, the quote-unquote first transgender vice secretary of public health, was made a 4-star admiral and was actually given 3 ribbons. Someone who has not been in a war was made a 4-star admiral and then given the U.S. Public Health Presidential Unit Citation, the Common Core Training Ribbon, and the COVID-19 Pandemic Medal Ribbon. So already we have an awarded 4-star admiral who has made international world history for being the first transgender 4-star general that has ever walked the earth, which means that we are now a step closer to actually achieving real equality in our country. Oh, and in case you're thinking that maybe if things get bad enough that we actually have to have a revolution, then yeah, sure, all the brass and all the officers will go on the other side. They'll go on the dark side. But all the two-fisted he-men who actually make up the core of the U.S. military will actually stand up for us. Take a look at how they're being trained.
Remember MLK. Remember MLK. He tried to lead the way. He tried to lead the way. But he was shot one day. He was shot one day. In the early morning. In the early morning. It's alright, it's alright.
You know, your eyes did not deceive you, gang. That was a tough-as-nails drill sergeant training her men by telling them that MLK was basically martyred by white devils. In other words, they're guilty of MLK's murder. And you don't want to defend people who are guilty by association with MLK's murder, Saint MLK. No. You can't have that at all. Point being, gang, weakness breeds weakness. Bullies are bullies because they are weak. That's why they're bullies. They're not strong enough to actually fight someone who is their equal. That's why they have to pick on people who are smaller than them. The only way out of that is to actually get bigger, like Michael Douglas says in The Ghost in the Darkness, which is actually a really good movie, and not a bad movie actually for Halloween now that I think of it. Doesn't take place in autumn, doesn't take place in October, doesn't take place anywhere near America or England or Ireland, the usual places you think of to have a gothic ghost story for Halloween. Takes place in sub-Saharan Africa, but I would say that 2 man-eating lions fit the bill for a monster. At least they're more interesting than the latest reincarnation of Michael Myers. Having so said, gang, I am wrapping up this latest edition of the Rolling Stone. Stay safe, stay free by daring to read, think, speak, and write. It's good to be back, and I will chat at you later. Ciao.